I never expected to become my grandmother's caretaker at 28. I had a promising career as an environmental engineer in Chicago, a small but trendy apartment, and a life that was finally finding its rhythm after years of hard work. But when Grandma Ellie called to tell me she'd fallen and broken her hip, everything changed. "It's nothing serious, Sam," she'd insisted over the phone, her voice weak despite her efforts to sound strong. "The doctor says I'll be fine after some rest." But I knew better. At 84, a broken hip was serious, and Grandma Ellie lived alone on the old family farm in rural Oklahoma, 20 miles from the nearest hospital and far from any relatives. The 100-acre farm had been in our family for 3 generations, though the actual farming had stopped years ago when Grandpa died. Now it was just Grandma in that big old farmhouse, surrounded by empty fields and memories. I took a leave of absence from my job and flew home the next day. The plan was to stay for 2 weeks, help Grandma get set up with in-home care, and return to my life. 2 weeks turned into a month turned into 3, and gradually I realized I couldn't leave her. "You're throwing your life away," my mother declared during one of her rare visits. Mom had moved to Phoenix years ago, preferring desert heat to Oklahoma dust. "Ellie needs to be in a nursing home. You need to be building your career." "I'm not throwing anything away," I replied, setting a cup of tea in front of her. "I'm working remotely, and Grandma's getting better every day." Mom snorted. "On that engineer's salary? Taking care of an old woman and a money pit of a farm? Be realistic, Samantha." That was my mother, always practical, always focused on financial security. She'd grown up on this farm and couldn't wait to escape it. In her eyes, my decision to stay was incomprehensible. My Uncle Peter was even worse. He called monthly from his vacation home in Florida, ostensibly to check on Grandma, but really to suggest listing the farm for sale. "That property's worth good money, Sam," he'd say, as if I didn't know. "Not the house. That's falling apart. But the land. Developers would snatch it up. Ellie could live comfortably in a nice facility, and there'd be plenty left over." By plenty left over, he meant his inheritance. Uncle Peter had never hidden his expectation that, as Grandma's only son, he deserved the lion's share of whatever she left behind. Then there were my cousins, Jessica and Mark, who visited on holidays with expensive gifts and loud voices, filling the quiet farmhouse with forced cheer before disappearing back to their busy lives. They never stayed long enough to help with Grandma's physical therapy or medication management. They certainly never emptied a bedpan or helped her bathe when she was too weak to do it herself. "You're a saint, Sam," Jessica would say, air kissing my cheek on her way out. "I don't know how you do it. Don't you get bored out here with nothing happening?" But there was plenty happening, just not the kind of excitement Jessica would recognize. There was Grandma regaining her ability to walk unassisted. There was the victory of her first trip up the stairs without pain. There was the garden we planted together, Grandma directing from her chair while I dug in the rich Oklahoma soil. And there were the stories. In the quiet evenings on the porch, watching the sun set over the empty fields, Grandma Ellie told me about her life. Stories I'd never heard before. About how she'd met Grandpa at a dance during World War II. About the early years on the farm when drought nearly ruined them. About the oil companies that had approached them decades ago, offering to buy mineral rights, and how Grandpa had steadfastly refused. "Edgar always said this land was our legacy, not something to be exploited," she explained, her weathered hands smoothing the quilt across her lap. "He wanted to pass it down intact, the way his father passed it to him." What she didn't tell me, what none of us knew, was that Grandpa hadn't simply refused those oil companies. He'd made a different kind of deal altogether. I found out a year later when Grandma Ellie passed away peacefully in her sleep. I'd been with her until the end, holding her hand as she drifted off, whispering that she was loved. The pain of losing her was sharp and deep, a physical ache that made it hard to breathe. The funeral was held in the small church where Grandma had attended services for over 60 years. The pews were filled with neighbors and friends, people whose lives she touched with her quiet kindness. My family was there too, of course. Mom flying in from Phoenix, Uncle Peter from Florida, cousins Jessica and Mark from their respective cities. "You look exhausted," Mom commented, eyeing me critically. "When was the last time you had a proper haircut?" I ignored the question, too tired for her particular brand of concern. I'd spent the last year caring for Grandma, watching her good days slowly become fewer than her bad ones. A haircut hadn't been a priority. After the service, everyone gathered at the farmhouse. It was the first time in years that the old place was full of people, the rooms echoing with voices instead of silence. I moved through the crowd in a daze, accepting condolences and trying to be a good host despite my grief. "Have you thought about what you'll do now?" Uncle Peter cornered me in the kitchen as I was refilling the coffee pot. "With Ellie gone, there's no reason for you to stay here." "I haven't decided," I said truthfully. My job in Chicago had long since been filled by someone else. The farm was the closest thing I had to a home now. "Well, don't make any hasty decisions," he advised, lowering his voice. "I've been talking to a developer who's very interested in this property. Once the will is settled, we could all do very well." I just nodded, too emotionally drained to argue. Let him have his plans. The truth was, I had no idea what Grandma's will contained. She'd updated it 6 months ago with her lawyer but hadn't shared the details with any of us. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following week at Mr. Harrington's law office in town. It was a small plain room with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines in the waiting area. We all gathered there, Mom, Uncle Peter, Jessica, Mark, and me, an awkward family reunion under fluorescent lights. Mr. Harrington was in his 70s, a contemporary of Grandma's who'd handled the family's legal matters for decades. He adjusted his glasses and began reading the formal legal language, while Uncle Peter leaned forward eagerly in his chair. "To my son, Peter," Mr. Harrington read, "I leave the sum of $50,000 and my collection of antique fishing gear that belonged to his father." Uncle Peter's face fell. $50,000 was a substantial amount, but nowhere near the value of the farm he'd been counting on. "To my daughter, Linda," the lawyer continued, nodding toward my mother, "I leave $50,000 and my jewelry collection, including the pearl necklace she always admired." Mom nodded stiffly, her expression unreadable. "To my grandchildren, Jessica and Mark, I leave $25,000 each, with the hope that they will use it wisely." Jessica and Mark exchanged glances. Like their father, they'd expected more. "And to my granddaughter, Samantha," Mr. Harrington adjusted his glasses again, "who stayed by my side when I needed her most, I leave the farmhouse and all 100 acres of the surrounding land, along with any assets or rights pertaining to that property." The room went silent. Then Uncle Peter let out a sharp laugh. "The farmhouse? That's falling apart. And those fields haven't produced a crop in years." "The land alone must be worth something," Mom interjected, giving me a calculating look. "Especially if that developer is still interested." Mr. Harrington cleared his throat. "There is a personal letter for Samantha as well," he said, handing me a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandma's shaky handwriting. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of paperwork and thinly veiled disappointment from my family. Uncle Peter was already on his phone as we left the office, presumably calling his developer contact to see if the deal could still be salvaged through me. "Don't make any decisions without consulting us," he instructed as we stood in the parking lot. That property represents a family legacy. A family legacy he'd been eager to sell to the highest bidder just minutes before. I noted silently. "You should at least hear what offers are out there," Mom added. "That old house needs more work than it's worth. Be practical, Samantha." I promised to think about it, mostly to end the conversation. All I wanted was to go back to the farm, my farm now, and read Grandma's letter in private. Once home, I sat on the porch swing where Grandma and I had spent so many evenings and carefully opened the envelope. "My dearest Sam, if you're reading this, I've moved on to be with your grandfather, and the farm is now yours. I want you to know this was always the plan, even before you came to help me after my fall. Your grandfather and I saw something in you from the time you were small, a love for this land that none of our other children or grandchildren shared. What you don't know, what none of the family knows, is that Edgar didn't simply refuse the oil companies all those years ago. He was shrewder than that. He sold mineral rights to a small portion of the property, just 10 acres on the far north corner, but retained the rights to the rest, believing that someday those rights would be far more valuable. He was right. 6 months ago, Mr. Harrington helped me negotiate a deal with Meridian Energy. They've confirmed significant oil deposits on our land, Sam. The contract is in the safe behind your grandfather's portrait in the study. The combination is our wedding date, 06 to 12/39. The first wells will be installed within a year of my passing. The income will be substantial, Enough to restore the farmhouse, enough to live comfortably, enough to do whatever you dream of doing while keeping our land intact. This is your legacy now. Not just the money, but the responsibility of stewardship. This land has been in our family for generations, and now I'm trusting it to you. I've seen how you care for things, Sam, how you tended to me, how you nurtured the garden, how you repaired the old porch swing without being asked. You have your grandfather's hands and heart. The others see the farm as a burden or a cash cow. You see it as a home. I love you, my sweet girl. Thank you for the gift of your time and care in my final years. I hope this gift I leave to you brings you as much joy as you brought to me. All my love, Grandma Ellie. I read the letter twice, tears streaming down my face, before going to the study. The safe behind Grandpa's portrait contained exactly what Grandma had described: a thick contract with Meridian Energy, along with geological surveys showing significant oil deposits across the property. The projected income was staggering. Millions over the life of the wells. I sat up all night, thinking about what this meant, about what Grandma had entrusted to me, about how to honor both the financial opportunity and the family legacy she described. By morning, I had a plan. For the next 6 months, I said nothing to my family about the oil rights. When Uncle Peter called with news of a developer willing to pay top dollar for the land, I politely declined. When Mom suggested selling at least part of the property to fund a real life back in the city, I changed the subject. That farmhouse is eating up all your savings, she warned during one phone call. You're as stubborn as Ellie was. Thank you, I replied, taking it as the compliment it wasn't intended to be. Meanwhile, Meridian Energy began the process of installing the first wells on my property. I worked closely with their environmental teams to ensure minimal disruption to the land. I used some of the initial payments to begin restoring the farmhouse, hiring local contractors to repair the roof and replace the ancient plumbing. When the first well was completed and ready to begin production, I decided it was time. I sent identical invitations to Mom, Uncle Peter, Jessica, and Mark. You were cordially invited to a gathering at the family farm to celebrate new beginnings, Saturday, June 12th, 2 p.m. They all accepted, probably curious about what I could possibly be celebrating in that money pit of a farm. The day of the gathering was perfect. Clear blue Oklahoma sky, gentle breeze, the fields around the farmhouse lush and green. I'd had the house painted, the porch rebuilt, the garden landscaped. It looked better than it had in decades. Uncle Peter arrived first, his luxury SUV kicking up dust on the long driveway. He stepped out and looked around with obvious surprise. Place looks different, he commented, taking in the improvements. You've been busy. I have, I agreed, leading him to the back porch where I'd set up refreshments. Mom, Jessica, and Mark arrived soon after, all making similar observations about the farm's transformation. This must have cost a fortune, Mom said suspiciously. Where did you get the money, Samantha? That's actually why I asked you all here today, I replied, handing each of them a glass of Grandma's favorite lemonade. I wanted to show you something. I led them across the backfield, following a newly graveled path toward the north corner of the property. As we crested a small hill, the oil well came into view, a pumping unit moving rhythmically up and down against the horizon. They all stopped in their tracks. Is that? Uncle Peter began, his voice faltering. An oil well. Yes, I confirmed. The first of several Meridian Energy will be installing over the next year. There's oil on this property? Mark asked incredulously. Quite a lot, according to the surveys. I handed each of them a copy of a simplified version of the contract. Grandpa suspected it decades ago. He sold mineral rights to a small section but kept the rest. Grandma finalized this deal 6 months before she died. They stared at the papers, then at the well, then at me, their expressions a mix of shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension. All this time, Uncle Peter said slowly, when we thought this land was worthless. It was never worthless, I corrected him. It was always valuable, as our family home, as our heritage, as the place Grandma and Grandpa built their lives. The oil is just a bonus. How much? Jessica asked bluntly, scanning the contract. How much is this worth? The projections are in the contract, I replied. But it's substantial. Mom looked up from the papers, her face pale. And Ellie left all of this to you? Just you? She left me the farm and everything pertaining to it, I confirmed, including the mineral rights. A heavy silence fell over the group as they processed the implications. The worthless farm they'd urged me to sell was now revealed as an asset worth millions. The year I'd wasted caring for Grandma had resulted in an inheritance beyond any of their expectations. "Well," Uncle Peter finally said, forcing a smile, "I suppose congratulations are in order. You certainly lucked out, Sam." "It wasn't luck," I said firmly. "Grandma made a choice, just like I'm making one now." I handed each of them a second document, a legal agreement establishing the Ellie and Edgar Williams Foundation. 50% of the oil revenues will go into this foundation, I explained. Its mission is to support sustainable agriculture, environmental conservation, and elder care in this county. I'm establishing it in Grandma and Grandpa's names. "And the other 50%? Mom asked. "Is mine," I said simply, "to maintain this farm, to live my life, and to ensure this land stays in the family for the next generation, just as Grandma and Grandpa wanted." "You could sell it all now and be set for life," Mark pointed out. "Why hang on to this place?" I looked around at the rolling fields, the old farmhouse in the distance, the big oak tree where Grandpa had built a swing decades ago. "Because some things are worth more than money," I said. "Grandma always told me that true wealth isn't what you have, but who you are." I believe that. My family stayed for another hour, asking questions about the oil deal, the foundation, my plans for the farm. The conversations were strained, undercurrents of regret and resentment flowing beneath their congratulatory words. But I didn't mind. I hadn't invited them to gloat or to make them feel guilty. I'd invited them because despite everything, they were still family, and because I wanted them to understand what Grandma had tried to teach us all, that care and presence matter more than material success. That legacy isn't just about money, and that sometimes the things that appear least valuable hold the greatest worth. After they left, I sat on the newly rebuilt porch swing as the sun began to set. In the distance, the oil well continued its steady rhythm, pulling hidden treasure from deep within the land. But the real treasure, I knew, was the lesson Grandma had left me: to see value where others see nothing, to care for what matters, and to understand that the richest legacies aren't always visible to the casual observer. I ran my hand along the smooth wood of the swing, feeling closer to Grandma than I had since her passing. "I understand now," I whispered to the evening air. "Thank you." And somewhere, I like to think, Grandma Ellie was smiling.